having made our way through the as far as the Romans, we'll shift back to what's happening in other countries, because after all, it isn't only in classical Greece and Rome that interesting things are going on. And most cultures, in fact, have their own, well, pretty much everyone who can discover alcohol and how to ferment things does discover how to ferment things. And an awful lot of the others also include it in their myths and so on. For instance, the Finns, Finns at the time of the Romans, have virtually no contact with the Romans. The empire does not really get up as far as Finland. And yet, if you look at the Kalevala, the Finnish hero cycle and myth cycle and so on, there are more lines about the creation of beer than there are about the creation of the world. That shows how important beer is to the general creative process. But we'll stick largely with Britain and with the Celtic cultures that kind of go across into Asterix territory and Gaul and so on. Beer had probably already come to us by then. It's thought likely that the beaker people, or at least beaker culture, depending on whether you think it is actual people or just a culture that comes in the Bronze Age, brought beer with them. And indeed that the beakers that give them their name were used for beer drinking. There's very little actual evidence of that. It's all down to just the occasional residue in the occasional pot. For instance, and some of these residues that actually go back before that. If you there's one in Kinloch on the Isle of Rum, which has residue from 4,000 years ago, which is back into the Neolithic. Well, up there it is, which has there's cups containing grain, meadowsweet, and royal fern. And there are other possible interpretations, but that's probably heather and meadowsweet ale. Alcohol evaporates so quickly, it's always pretty much impossible to be sure that a container was the alcoholic version of something. But there are a few similar sort of traces found through the Bronze Age. But the first good evidence you get in Britain is in the Iron Age and is from very close to home for me. It was found in Cambridgeshire, very near Peterborough, last year. And they found little pieces of crushed sort of charcoal-like material, which turn out to be crushed and boiled grains and little cracked pieces of bran, which have been, which have been interpreted as showing, suggesting a brewing process going on there. So that's about 400 BC. Of course, by this point we have much better evidence on the continent that it's going on, because, of course, it takes less time for the Roman and Greek influence to get to places that are closer to them. So, for instance, if you look at, there's a marvellous grave called the Hockdorf Chieftain's Grave, which goes from about 100 years before there's any evidence in this country. And amongst all of his personal finery, there's all these he's laid out with all his jewellery and all the beautiful things. Amongst that, there are 9 drinking horns, and there is a bronze cauldron, or if you like, you could think of it as a bronze crater, because it's from Greece. It's an import from Greece, and in Greece, of course, that shape of vessel would be a crater for shared drinking, and a cauldron at this point, this does seem to be for drinking rather than for cooking, so effectively it's a crater. And the residue in that is pollen, which leads to the conclusion that it's probably had mead in it. And if it has had mead in it, well, you could fill that container with 100 gallons. And that's a lot of mead to get through, even amongst 9 of you. So he is going to be well stocked in the afterlife, very much so. So the Celts, of course, have a choice between beer drinking and wine drinking, because they are in contact with other cultures who are doing those things as well. The Romans would say, that lot, the barbarians, they're all beer drinkers, but actually they were very fond of their wine. It's an expensive import, is the thing. They're not drinking it because they can't afford it. There's one Roman author who says that the Gauls, so the Celts in France, loved wine so much that they even drink it without diluting it, the rebels. The same chap says that Celts at dinner are really fascinating to watch because they have these enormous moustaches. It's part of Celtic warrior aristocracy culture to have really luxuriant moustaches. And Diodorus says that these become entangled in the food, and when they are drinking, the beverage passes, as it were, through a kind of strainer. So they're sieving all their drink with their tash. And also from Celtic France, there are amazing flasks that are like nothing you find anywhere else, which are basically donut shaped, this sort of size, and donut shaped like that, but with a neck and two little handles in the neck like that. And they have inscriptions written around them, and they're in Latin because obviously it's Roman occupied at the time. Think Asterix. And the inscriptions are things like, "Waitress, fill the flask with wheat beer," or "Innkeeper, do you have any spiced wine? This needs to be filled." So these people know what they want, and they want it in that circular, it's a very odd shape for a vessel. And there have been buildings excavated that are thought to be taverns as well. There's one in France from about 175 BC, and you can see that it has a fireplace, millstones and ovens, reclining seats. There are plates and there are bowls found, which suggests that the locals are starting to do the sort of Roman thing of eating out at lunchtime rather than cooking all their own food. And there are lots of drinking bowls for wine found there. Another similar building is actually found up in Scotland, further north than Edinburgh. So you're getting well up past the Antonine Wall in a place that is influenced by the Romans, but definitely isn't a Roman territory, and suggests more cultural exchange than you might otherwise think, which has a patio and an internal space and the various bowls for food and drink and the spout of a really quite posh wine jug, suggesting they've got hold of some really nice imported wine there. And of course in Celtic culture, beer and mead play a big part in the sort of warrior traditions, but those stories, of course, don't get written down till a lot later than that. And in any case, I'm sure Dave Silk would be far better placed to tell you all about the myths and legends of the Celtic drinkers than I am. Now, in Anglo-Saxon times, in this country, once the Anglo-Saxons move in, they also have a range of different drinking options. The trouble is we don't always know what the words that are used then mean. They don't necessarily correlate directly to our words. Sometimes it seems like the point isn't so much what it's actually made of as the role that it's serving at the time. So they have eilu, beo, medu, and wine. I may be pronouncing those incorrectly. And you might think you know what those are, but as we'll come to in a moment, you don't necessarily. Of course, all of them are in many ways safer than the water. It's fine if you have a well or a spring, but streams, they're aware that streams could carry all manner of interesting things in them, from where animals have been drinking in them and dying in them and whatever. There's an Anglo-Saxon cure recorded for swallowing creeping things, which rather suggests they know that you can accidentally take in parasites with your water. The cure, incidentally, is to drink hot sheep's blood. Wouldn't recommend that one. Elfric's colloquy, which is this marvellous sort of schoolboy conversations in which they take on roles and interview. So you find out all about all sorts of interesting jobs that way. The teacher says, "What do you have to drink?" And the boy says, "I drink ale, usually, if I drink at all, and water if I have no ale." And the teacher says, "Don't you drink wine?" And the boy replies, "No, I am not rich enough to be able to buy myself wine. Wine is not a drink for boys or fools, but for old men and wise men." I think the money aspect is the big problem there, because I think most people, you can't afford wine, but beer is standard for everyone. Now, the question is which word actually is being used for that, because elu is probably beer, ale, But the word Beor, people aren't sure what it is. Some people think that it might be mead, might relate to the word bee after all. Or perhaps it's cider, or perhaps it's some sort of fermented fruit juice. There's supposed to be one reference to the locals up here having an apple-based alcoholic drink when the Romans arrive. But a lot of people mentioned it on the internet, and I cannot find anyone who gives the original quote from which it comes. So maybe there's one reference to that, but if there is, I can't find it. Until the very late Anglo-Saxon time, all of the apples would be quite sour crab apples anyway, which isn't to say you can't make cider out of them. What you can't do is just eat them whole. Other people say Beor might be hopped ale, which is what it comes to be in much later times. The hops, there are wild hops out there. But it definitely isn't just ale, because they're used in the same sentence to refer to different things. It also seems to be stronger than ale. So another suggestion is maybe one's the first mash and one's the second mash. We just don't know. And one of the things we usually use to help with that, which is glosses from one language to another, really don't work because some of them are very clearly wrong. If you use enough of the right glosses, you can make it so that any drink is exactly the same thing as any other drink. If you use the different Anglo-Saxon to Latin, back to Anglo-Saxon, back to Latin versions, you can end up anywhere. So clearly that's not going to help. Medu does seem to relate to a sweet wine, at least, or a sweet honey-related drink is the sweetness that makes the difference. There's also something called braggot, which is probably ale sweetened with honey. On the continent, there are several laws which ban selling it while pretending it's mead, which I think is hilarious given that these days there is an increasing trend for mead to not be real mead, but to be other things with honey added, and whether you should be allowed to still call them mead or not. That argument has been going on for a very long time. There were law codes in this country as well. Even in the early penitentials, you can see a little bit about how ale selling is going on. So as early as 616, Ethelbert of Kent restricts the number of ale sellers allowed sort of per village. In 680, Theodore, the Archbishop of Canterbury, says that any Christian layman who drinks too much should get 15 days of penance, which is probably 15 days of fasting and prayer. In the 720s, King Ine of Wessex says, if they quarrel at their drinking of Beor, and one of them bears it with patience, the other is to pay 30 shillings as a fine. So whichever one of you gets more raggy is going to have to pay the other one. Ecgbrecht of York, who's Archbishop, thinks there's so much drinking going on, he has to bring out an edict that no priest should eat or drink in a tavern. Priests should not be going there. Another penitential says, okay, so we're going to give a penance to anyone who's drunk, but how are we going to tell if you're drunk? What is the standard for drunkenness which requires penance? Well, they have an answer to that as well. They are considered drunk if they change their mind, when they stutter in their speech and their eyes are wild, and they have vertigo and distension of the belly and pain follows. That's how you can tell you're drunk enough that you need to do a penance over it. In 965, King Edgar, who is known as King Edgar the Peaceful, acting on advice of his bishop, Dunstan, says that there should be only one alehouse per settlement, and he also regulates the size of drinking vessels. And he says that each drinking vessel should contain 4 pints, and that it should be measured in pegs, which are put into little holes down the side of the cup, so that you could tell, and they're probably set at half a pint, we think, so that you could tell how much you were drinking from that, and you were supposed to just sort of drink 1 peg's worth at a time. But it saves on vessels to have bigger vessels with pegs in. There's a theory that that's where the phrase of taking someone down a peg or two comes from, but I'm really not convinced by that one. But it does suggest there is communal drinking, that people are passing around the same thing and each drinking down a peg. In 1102, Anselm does forbid priests from drinking to the pegs, which suggests that it's a bit of a challenge and that pin drinking down is something of a sport. And again, I think we've that as a sport continues right into the 18th century at least. So there are buildings that we could call ale houses, but we know very, very little about what that actually means, and whether it's a sort of ad hoc thing or a longer term thing. Probably the former, given what happens after that. But the other place, the main place, of course, you might be getting your drinking done, is in what we'd think of as a mead hall. A mead hall, of course, sounds a lot posher than being an ale hall, even if what you're doing is mostly serving ale in it. So they're largely called mead halls. And every lord in Saxon and Viking times is going to build themselves this a grand hall, and they're probably going to live there, and they use it for all sorts of other purposes as well. But one of the purposes of it is for people to gather in the evening round the fire, have the food, and have their drink. And it's a way of showing hospitality and generosity, and also very much of showing your power, and showing just what you can achieve. When the Saxons looked at the Roman ruins of Bath, and they saw these huge buildings, they misidentified them. In the poem The Ruin, it starts, "Mead Hall once stood right here," because they assume that any building that grand has got to be a mead hall. And we get little descriptions of what they might have been like. In Judith, there's a description, there were deep bowls which were carried along the benches often, likewise cups and pitchers full to the people who were sitting on couches. And there would be women present, although at least some of them would be serving, but that is not a low status role in Saxon times. In fact, the role of the lady of the hall is absolutely vital. She is keeping things sociable and friendly and keeping everybody food and water. These things would often start off very formally. The queen would serve the first drink to her husband, and then this would be the moment in which she could speak publicly, it would seem. If she wanted to make an announcement herself, then as she was giving her the drink to her husband would be the moment to do it. And then, obviously, to a certain extent, the other people that she goes to next with the drink, it can also be a political statement. And this is a really important part of a woman's role, is being able to give out the drinks. There's a 13th century poetry manual that advises bards to refer to women. And when they're describing women, they should refer to their clothing and their jewellery, and also to the ale, wine, and other beverages she serves, likewise in terms of receptacles for all of these things that is fitting for her to do or provide. So what she is a clothes horse and a drinks dispenser, broadly speaking. The actual words they use are things like mead maiden and ale giver. One saga has a king who has 2 jealous wives, and he decides that he's going to stay with whichever one of them gives him the best ale when he comes back from a battle. Which one of them can best provide for him after he's returned all tired. I don't know off the top of my head how that particular story resolves itself. It does seem a very strange way to choose which wife to stay with, and you do wonder what the women had to say about this. But of course, another word given to these women at this point was peace weaver, and that may well be needed when the men are quite that drunk. Beowulf is given, of course, very high praise by the poet. He's the hero of the story. But the highest praise, or one of them, seems to be, he never killed his friends while he was drunk. I mean, go Beowulf. He doesn't kill his friends even when he's drunk. Like that's a rare enough thing to be worth mentioning in a saga. The word drunken is used several times in the Beowulf, and it's not generally kind of seen as a negative thing. It's just part of male culture, but he doesn't even try and kill them. Good on him. We can get a little window into these sort of brawls in the Fortunes of Men poem, which describes how all the different ways that Saxons can die, basically. And it says, "Some angry, ale-swilling, wine-soaked will die by the sword's edge upon the mead bench because of hasty words." I think that sums that up quite nicely. In Judith, again, the devil says that that's all his fault. He says, "I have led on some by my counsels and brought them into discord, so that suddenly, drunk on Beor, they renewed old grievances. I have served them strike from out of the cup, so that by resorting to swords within the wine hall, being stricken with wounds, they released their souls to flit doomed away from their body." So drunken fighting does seem to be half the course, albeit not considered to be a good thing necessarily. Weirdly, there is no mention in any of these stories of people getting drunk and being sick, or getting drunk and having ill-advised drunken sex. What tends to happen is they get drunk, they might wrestle a bit, then they drink some more, maybe sing a bit, and fall asleep in the hall. That's why in Beowulf, Grendel is able to come in while they are all vulnerable and asleep on the floor, and it's not the only story that has that kind of element in, that the warriors will all just fall asleep on the floor where they are because they've drunk that much. And other stories, of course, where somebody just locks the door and burns the building down and everyone's too drunk and asleep to notice. They very rarely mention drinking horns, curiously, although there definitely are a few around. They've found a few. If you look at the Sutton Hoo finds, absolutely enormous auroch horns. There's a few references, but not as many as you might expect. And the situation for the Norse is very similar. And if you look at, say, the Havamal, there are lots of references to the idea of drinking being good, but don't drink so much that you do something stupid. The Havamal is full of sort of wise words for warriors of that variety. And alcohol, of course, turns up a lot in the myths as well. Again, there are others who can tell those stories far better than me, but I can say that Odin is at one point said to only drink wine, which of course would be very expensive and fancy for the Norse, but that's kind of the point. Most pantheons have a chief god who has a sort of drunken sidekick who causes the trouble, but in the Norse tradition, it's actually Odin who is the drunken one. The name actually means frenzied one, and that might be in relation to drink. He doesn't have a sidekick who's the god of alcohol. He is the god of alcohol himself. It's that important to them. We can also say the Valkyries serve to the warriors in the halls of Valhalla ale that has flowed from the udders of a great she-goat, Hydron the she-goat. And the Norse stories of how ale comes into being in the first place are just brilliant. Briefly speaking, the warring gods all get together to make peace, and they all spit into a kettle together, and out of it comes Kvasir, the wise and the generous. That spitting thing, it's worth thinking back to the idea that in a lot of early cultures, the way you start a beer brew is by chewing some of the barley mash and spitting it out. That's part of the creative process. So Kvasir, the wise and generous, is somewhat related to alcohol himself. Now, Kvasir shares his knowledge until a couple of dwarves kill him, and they drain his blood, mix it with honey, and this makes the mead of poetry. And then there's this whole thing about how Odin steals the mead back in his stomach, and then when he escapes, he brings some of it back up again. Not so much in a throwing up, more in like like feeding a baby bird way, and that becomes good poetry. And the stuff that comes from the other end of Odin is bad poetry. I think it's really nice, but it isn't just poetry; it's the mead of poetry. That's the important thing. Because for them as well, wine is at the top if you can afford it, and then mead, and then ale. But even the ale is quite strong. It's, reconstructions put it like 7 or 8%, so very sort of dark and malty. And there's an actual word for a drunken Viking feast, which sounds like a good way to spend an evening. And it's a sumble, possibly a sumbler, not entirely sure. And again, they're drinking from all sorts of plain pottery, from wood, from horn potentially. Some of them will also be drinking from glass. You might have seen one of these before. the Hrimkalder, which is a frost cup. And of course it's called frost because this reminds people not in the know of ice. And this particular one is a funnel glass, which is a cone. Whether it goes in one of these originally, I'm not entirely sure, but these have been found on various archaeological sites. And of course, you need something to rest it in, because if you don't, it'll just keel over when you put it down. So maybe you're just supposed to down them in one, as indeed is true of drinking horns as well. And they also had little tiny ones. You'd think that was a modern kind of design, like little modern shot glass, but it's not. That's a Viking thing, presumably for their wine, because it's so expensive that you're going to want to drink it in tiny amounts. And finally, one more custom from the Viking era that I'm particularly fond of is to do with alcohol, which is the bragaful, the promise cup. And what happens then is you swear you'll do something, and then you drink. And if you do that, it's completely binding. If you do it and then you drink to it, that makes it much more binding than if you just say the words, because you have drunk from the promise cup, then that's a really good promise. It's fated to be. If you want to be absolutely sure that it is going to stick, you say it while your other hand is on top of a pig ball. You do that with one hand, you say what you're going to do with the other, and you drink. And the combination of the two, you then kill the boar, and the vow that you've drunk on the promise cup gets taken straight up to Freya. And woe betide you if you do not then keep that promise. Freya will not be impressed. So that's quite a quick whistle, I think, through some of the elements of secular drinking culture for people over quite a wide period of time when you get down to it. Next time, what we will do is shift across to church culture, shift across to what's going on in the monasteries, because there's all sorts of strange stuff going on, and new developments in the nature of alcohol making, and different distilling processes and so on are just kicking off in the medieval period over in the monasteries. So I will leave you with that thought, and again say, don't drink too much, and if you do drink and make promises, don't do it while your other hand is on a pig, because otherwise, could be trouble ahead for you. And on that note, I shall bid you a good night. If I can find the right button for it.